Hi, everybody. My name is Nick Bryant of the Nick Bryant Podcast. First of all, I want to thank all of my listeners, subscribers, and patrons. I'm very grateful for your support. Starting next week, my podcast will incorporate a Patreon paywall, which means 2 episodes a month will be free, but to listen to all 4 episodes will require a $4 a month Patreon status. Currently, I have a number of $1 a month Patreons, but if you're a $1 a month patron, you need not fret because you will be grandfathered in. In addition to having access to all Nick Bryant podcast episodes, a $4 a month Patreon will exclusively have access to all my future blogs. And you will also have access to all my Franklin scandal documentation that we will be posting incrementally on my website. I'd also like to offer you a free toaster, but I only have one of those. If you want to become a $4 a month patron of my podcast, please go to patreon.com/the Nick Bryant Podcast, or click on the Patreon link on this YouTube page or the Patreon link on my website. Now that I see people have a sincere interest in justice for victims, my website will also link to an activist website in the coming weeks, because watching the government and mainstream media cover up the Jeffrey Epstein child trafficking network is anathema to me. We cannot stop at Ghislaine Maxwell. Scores of identified perpetrators and pimps are presently walking free with impunity. By covering up the Epstein trafficking network, our government is aiding and abetting child trafficking. As an individual, would you ever trust anyone who is aiding and abetting child trafficking? As Americans, how can we trust our government that is aiding and abetting child trafficking? My paywalled episode next week will focus on the Johnny Gosch abduction. As you may know, I co-produced Who Took Johnny, a documentary about that abduction. Next week, I will provide subject matter that wasn't in the documentary.
The paper reports that 2 of the male prostitutes were given a late-night tour of the White House last year.
I think I'm entitled. You want answers.
I want the truth.
You can't handle the truth.
Hi, everybody. My name is Nick Bryant, and welcome to the Nick Bryant Podcast. Today, my guest is Lucia Osborne-Crowley. How are you doing today, Lucia?
I'm doing very well. Thank you for having me on. I'm a big fan.
Lucia is a very talented woman. In addition to being a survivor, she's a lawyer and a journalist and an author. She's currently on the staff of Law 360, and she's written 2 books, I Choose Elena and My Body Keeps Your Secrets. So you have followed the Epstein case very, very closely. And,
yes.
And I have followed it very, very closely. And one of the things that people seem to miss is that this was a conspiracy. Where Jeffrey Epstein was pandering these underage girls to multiple perpetrators, but yet only one of them is indicted. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, I think it's something we really, really need to keep talking about because, I attended every single day of the Ghislaine Maxwell trial and I heard all of that evidence, but it is a bit strange to hear about someone who was helping to traffic all of these underage girls, but never hearing about the people that they were being trafficked to. And you can't help but question that. We need to know who these clients were. We know that there were very powerful people involved in this sex abuse pyramid scheme, as the prosecutors called it. And yet, none of those people have been charged or indicted. And I think that's a real problem because, I think it's important that justice was served. And I know it's important for some of the survivors that I know that justice was served in the Maxwell case, but it just doesn't go far enough if we're not actually asking who these men were that they were being forced to have sex with when they were children. There's lots of names that have been swirling around, but nothing sticks. I myself am investigating a number of names that I hope to be able to corroborate and report on. But I just don't want the story to end here. I think the Maxwell trial was really important, but it can't be where the story ends, because there are just so many people who were involved in this scheme who were actually, sexually assaulting underage girls, who were just out there living their lives, knowing that they did this, and seeing that only one person has gone to jail for it.
It is kind of mind-boggling that no one other than Ghislaine Maxwell has been indicted. And ironically, we know the names of a number of these perpetrators. They have come out through civil litigation.
Yep.
And they've been completely unscathed by law enforcement. And then we know the names of procurers. And they've been completely unscathed by law enforcement.
Yeah. I mean, this is one of the things that we kept saying in the press gallery at the Maxwell trial. There were so many names of recruiters that came up just through the story, just through testimony of the witnesses. They had to come up because it was part of the story of how they met Ghislaine and Jeffrey through all of these recruiters. And we just kept asking ourselves, where are they? Because as far as I can tell, as a trained lawyer, there's plenty of evidence from that trial alone to indict them as part of this conspiracy. And yet the DOJ has said now a couple of times that they're not going to indict people like Leslie Groff, for example, who was a PA to Jeffrey Epstein. And, I've seen emails from her arranging all sorts of things with victims, and a lot of evidence about her came out at trial. And enough, again, I'm not a prosecuting lawyer in the Southern District of New York, but based on what I do know as a lawyer, it seems like there is enough to indict someone, a recruiter like her, but yet there seems to be no political or legal will to do so.
And Sarah Kellen is another one.
Yes.
She was as malicious to these girls and young women as Maxwell was. I mean, yep. She was trained very, very well to be a pimp. It's interesting. The New York Times wrote an article where they named 6 procurers, and one of them was Maxwell, but 5 others were named. And I mean, the New York Times and those procurers have been, really pimps, have been unscathed by law enforcement, and we know exactly who they are.
Well, absolutely. And, Sarah Kellen is a perfect example. Most of the survivors have named her in their civil lawsuits against back while Epstein was still alive. She was named in civil lawsuits against Epstein and Maxwell. And there is so much evidence in those civil lawsuits. If you know how to trawl through court records like I do, there is so much evidence against her that is already out there. It's not a case of taking up time and resources to look for this evidence. It's there. And again, we heard so much evidence against Sarah Kellen at the Maxwell trial, just through the testimony of other witnesses. And so, again, it seems to me, based on my legal training, that it would be very, very easy to charge her with similar conspiracy charges that Ghislaine Maxwell was indicted on. But again, they keep saying that they're not going to do that. And to be honest with you, Nick, I don't understand it, and I am in close touch with a lot of survivors, obviously because I'm investigating this case and I'm writing a book about it, and they find this really distressing, because they could walk past their recruiters on the street, or and it's very upsetting to know that for them to know that the government is not interested in prosecuting some of the people who were really instrumental. I mean, we had a 5-week trial about how Ghislaine was the vessel through which Jeffrey acquired these girls, because if a middle-aged man approached a 14-year-old girl at a summer arts camp, for example, something would feel wrong. Whereas if a 31-year-old woman approaches her, it feels safer. And that was the story that we heard at trial. And that's exactly what people like Sarah Kellen and Leslie Groff and I know many, many other names, that's exactly what they did as well, is they made these girls feel safe, much safer than they would have felt with a middle-aged man coming up to them in a bar or whatever. And there is huge culpability attached to that. And to be honest, I really don't understand. I would like to see them put on trial, because I think we'd learn a lot more about this pyramid scheme if we could have a public trial against some of these recruiters. I really believe the more I report on this, and it breaks my heart because I wish this wasn't true, but the more I report on this, the more I really feel that the Maxwell trial barely scratched the surface in terms of, what actually happened here.
So we were talking about Sarah Kellen, and I acquired her unpublished cell phone number, and I gave her a call. And
did you?
I did, and all that she could talk about was how mean the media was to her.
Which is a line that Ghislaine Maxwell is relying on as well at the moment.
It's amazing. I mean, that's really indicative of sociopathology and seismic narcissism, of not being able to take responsibility for your actions.
Exactly. And I think we've seen that on display, so many times over the last year. I mean, at sentencing, Ghislaine spoke. And the whole point of a defendant speaking at sentencing is to make amends and to apologize. And she couldn't do it. She said, meeting Jeffrey Epstein is the worst mistake I've ever made. I'm sorry that for the pain that was caused to the victims. That language is so specific. There's no I in that sentence. She could not acknowledge that this was pain that she had caused. And it sounds like from your conversation that, a lot of the recruiters feel the same way.
Last night, Ghislaine Maxwell, her interview was aired, and you watched it. What were your thoughts on that interview?
I mean, to be honest, it was quite a strange one. Firstly, I would say she didn't say anything in particular that she didn't say to the Daily Mail a month or two ago. So it was billed, I think, as much more exclusive than it was. I do think it's quite bizarre to have to give such a huge platform to someone who's been convicted as a sex offender. It's not often. Just that, I don't know, I'm sure you were watching it too, but just that image of seeing her on the phone in the, you don't see that very often. And the reason you don't see that very often is that most people who are convicted of very serious crimes don't get international airtime. I also think, we heard a lot of the same narrative that we heard both at sentencing and in that interview she did with the Daily Mail, which was that she thinks that she's a scapegoat, essentially. I mean, she thinks that she has been punished for Jeffrey Epstein's crimes. She didn't apologize to the victims. I think Jeremy Kyle said at one point, this was an alarming lack of apology from the victim, because she was asked directly, what do you have to say to the victims? And all she could say was, that Jeffrey Epstein did terrible things. So, and I was on the phone to victims last night right after the interview, and of course it was very, very upsetting for them, because it was remarkable to watch her once again, as I saw in person at sentencing, completely fail to acknowledge that these crimes involved her. She really does seem to think that just because Jeffrey's dead, she is the person who takes the fall. And she kind of takes this tepid kind of moral line where she says, well, that's okay, I should take the fall, that's fine. But that's very different from admitting what she actually did. And so I think that interview was very upsetting for victims for two reasons. One is that, again, it's very strange to be given that kind of airtime, and secondly, because she, again, when asked, failed to apologize to them. I did think it was interesting. Again, she said this perhaps in not so many words in the interview with the Mail, but she said, I don't believe Jeffrey was murdered. I believe Jeffrey was murdered. I don't believe he committed suicide. I think that's interesting to hear from her. But overall, I thought the tone of it was just very bizarre, and I don't think we learned much that was new, except that she is sticking to her line, which is, that she's been mistreated by being a scapegoat for Jeffrey Epstein, and that he committed terrible crimes, and he got away with it because he died, and so she has to go to prison on his behalf. And so, after, what are we now, 12 months, or more than that, since she was actually arrested in a federal prison, she's had a lot of time to think, and that's still her line. And I know firsthand how disappointing that is to victims.
I read Silence No More, Surviving My Journey to Hell and Back by Sarah Ransom, and Maxwell comes across as big a monster as Jeffrey Epstein.
Oh, absolutely. And, sitting in that room at sentencing, Sarah, who I know very well, and Liz Stein, who I know very well, and a lot of the other survivors gave victim impact statements, which I think are a really important part of the justice system. And they all said, and this again was the narrative at trial, and I've spoken to members of the jury, and I know that they took this as the credible narrative, they believe this to be true, is that he would not have been able to do any of this without her. She really was essential in terms of grooming, and that's about gaining trust and about isolating a victim from their parents, for example, identifying vulnerable victims whose parents are absent or who are addicts, or and she did that meticulously, and in that room at sentencing, it was so hard to hear the victims say what I know they feel, which is that if she hadn't been involved, their lives would have been completely different. Like she was the one who gave him access to him, and the fact that she has continued to fail to, she got up to speak straight after them, and she said, I remember so clearly, she said, "Oh, that was very hard to hear. That was very hard to hear, the harm that was caused to you by Jeffrey Epstein." But that's not what they said. What they said was, we would have never been raped and sexually abused by Jeffrey Epstein if there wasn't a woman, big sister / mother figure, depending on the age and the time in the scheme, who made them feel safe. And that comes across very, very well in Sarah's book, and Sarah's book is fantastic, and I think everyone should read it, because it gives a real honest insight into what actually happened here, which I think is really lacking in the public domain, to be honest. It's an excellent book, and I know personally that that's how a lot of the victims feel. I mean, she was the reason that they became entrapped by him. If it weren't for her, it would have been very hard for him to procure teenage girls.
But not only was she procuring, but she was vicious to them.
Yes,
Vicious.
yes.
There's that line in Vanity Fair where she's asked about the girls, and she says, "Oh, they're nothing.
They're nothing. They're trash." Exactly. They're trash. Yeah. And
go ahead.
Sorry. No, I was just going to say, from my relationship with victims, that is exactly how she treated them. You know, she treated them with contempt. I mean, there was always a kind of, and we heard a lot at trial about the stages of grooming, and there was always a stage at the beginning of being interested in their hobbies and their talents, and you know that the whole story is about, oh, my boyfriend's a philanthropist, and he can help you get into college, or he can, you know, all of that, and he, you know, then she would kind of turn on them and become the person that we later heard about at trial, who could be very, very nasty, and really emotionally abusive and really controlling, and that kind of thing, especially, you know, that kind of thing, it leaves lasting damage, and I know it has for all the victims that I know.
Indeed, she was a monster in her own right. And you covered the Maxwell trial, and I was so disappointed by that trial. I realized it was going to be carefully choreographed when only 4 witnesses were called, and the 4 witnesses that were called weren't part of the larger network. They were molested by Maxwell and Epstein, and that really, I mean, it was so carefully choreographed that I was just disgusted with it. Even before the trial, I just knew it was going to be a cover-up.
Absolutely, and I think you and I were speaking on the phone the other day, and you used that word choreographed, and ever since you used it, you know, it's been the exact right word in my mind to describe that trial. It really was incredibly narrow. It was surprising to all of us in the press gallery who have spent years, you know, looking up all the details of this scheme, and yet we heard very little actually about it over those 5 weeks. The prosecution was, it only took 2 weeks. It ended early. There was a lot of witnesses that they didn't call. And again, as you said, the most important thing from my perspective is that they only called 4 victim witnesses to testify. And I'm investigating that at the moment. I personally want an answer to why that was the case. I know that there were other victims who were willing to testify. And I remember so clearly sitting in the press gallery, and we all said, why only 4? You know what? You know, we know that more than 150 made claims to the Epstein Victims Compensation Fund, and we know that there are hundreds, maybe even thousands. I mean, this scheme goes back to the 80s, as far as I'm aware from my reporting at the moment. There are hundreds of people who could have testified at that trial, and 4, and as you said, they were a select 4. Who couldn't necessarily speak to the broader scheme, and I really question that, and I really want answers on that, because you know, this could and should have been the trial of the century. You know, this was their one shot. I mean, they let Jeffrey Epstein die in jail. They haven't indicted anyone else. This was the only trial we might get for what really is the world's biggest sex trafficking conspiracy that has damaged so many people. You know, and as I said, I know these victims so well now, and I see that damage, and it feels so unfair that there was kind of one shot at actual justice, and it felt just completely half-hearted to me.
Well, if I was a victim and of any perpetrator, and I saw what happened in the Maxwell trial, I mean, that would make me feel very uneasy about coming
Exactly.
because so much has been covered up.
Yes,
Alexander
exactly.
Costa, when he became Trump's Secretary of Labor for a while, and he was the U.S. attorney that basically covered up Epstein et al. And when he was being interviewed by the Trump administration, he was asked, "Why did you stand down?" And he said, "I was told that Epstein was intelligence and to leave it alone." And he's never denied that. And
Yes.
what's really interesting, there's only two people in the United States that can tell a U.S. attorney to stand down. One is the president and one is the attorney general. Those
Yep.
are the only two people.
Yep.
So the strings were pulled at the apex of power
Absolutely.
to cover up Epstein. And I saw this exact same thing play out with the Franklin scandal.
Yep.
Except in the Franklin scandal, not a single child was abused. That's the government line at this point. But I think to myself, if our government, if some dark, malignant corner of intelligence is trafficking girls, which I believe happened in the Epstein case and also in the Franklin case, and using them, these children, as blackmail, but that dark corner of malignant corner of intelligence has the power to shut down a U.S. attorney. And in the case of Franklin, there were a couple of U.S. attorneys that were shut down.
Yeah.
How can we believe our government on anything if the government is willing to let child molesters cover up for child molesters?
Well,
Go ahead.
exactly. And that's exactly how a lot of us felt coming out of the Maxwell trial. I mean, the fact that the jury came back with a guilty verdict on 5 out of the 6 counts is something. But of course it means something. But we were all left with this sense of kind of what's happened here, and how can we trust that this is the whole story, and what aren't we being told, and why? And I just feel like part of that trial was about trying to kind of close the book on this case and trying to say, okay, well, we've done the trial, we've convicted someone, they're in a federal prison for 20 years, and that can be the end of the story. And I hope for all of us journalists, it's really important that doesn't happen, because there's so much more to this. Even in the 12 months since the trial that I've been reporting, there is so much more than what we heard at trial. And as you say, it means, how can we trust the FBI, federal investigators, federal prosecutors, to tell the truth? And I think that puts even more responsibility on journalists to find the victims and to find out just how far this went.
I've been working on this story since 2012. At this point, I do not see the government going after these perpetrators. The mainstream media has more or less co-signed what the government has given us, the bullshit that the government has given us.
Yep.
If there's going to be justice, it's going to have to be a social movement.
Yes.
It's going to have to, people are going to have to arise, like Dutroux in Belgium. A child molester in Belgium, and a number of people in law enforcement came out and said that he was in a network of affluent, powerful people, and that it was being covered up. And what we saw is at least 200,000 Belgians hitting the streets.
Yeah, which is exactly what I feel should be happening here. I mean,
that has got to happen here, or else we're never going to have justice. And I think that with the Epstein case, if you bore down or auger in enough, you're going to come across the cesspool that is our government.
Yep.
And that the media doesn't report on. And
Exactly.
the cesspool that includes blackmail, that includes child molestation, and a myriad of other crimes.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And I think, I think that's exactly the point. And that's why a lot of people, I think, have shied away from it, because it is so frightening to see up close, just how well people can be protected, if if the people in power choose to protect them. As you said earlier, there are names that we all know about that have been, people have been named in civil lawsuits, and all of that have been completely unscathed criminally. And it is very, very worrying to know that the government, for some reason, is protecting those people.
I remember when the verdict came in, I looked at my LinkedIn page and her feed, and all these anti-trafficking organizations were rejoicing. And I was so utterly disgusted by that, that they were basically co-signing the cover-up by rejoicing that Ghislaine Maxwell had been sentenced to 20 years in prison. If the government really wanted to go after Epstein, they would have used the RICO law, which was used to dismantle the mafia. What happens in the RICO law is you get low-level underlings, and then you indict them, and then they roll over on the people that are above them, and then those people get indicted, and then they roll over, and it goes all the way to the top of the organization. Those procurers easily could have gotten multiple life sentences. Child trafficking is 15 years to life. Yep. And those procurers could have gotten multiple life sentences, and they would have rolled over, and they would have been staring at 1,000 years, and they would have rolled over on the perps in a heartbeat.
Absolutely.
If this was actually treated with any kind of competent jurisprudence.
Totally. And I think that's what gives the game away. I mean, there is some lack of political or legal will here to actually get to the bottom of this, because, as you say, if these younger recruiters were put on trial, and again, I was in the room, I saw the evidence against them, very, very strong. If they were put on trial, it would, as you say, it would be very easy for them to give evidence about people further up the chain. And I've spoken to many victims who have asked me to help find their recruiters, because there were so many of them. Mm-hmm. There really were so this was Ghislaine Maxwell, and also there were girls doing this in the 80s before Ghislaine was even in New York. There are so many recruiters who this job for Jeffrey Epstein. Most of them, we don't even know where they are. But what was it that they're not being looked for, and they certainly haven't been. And it, as you say, it does seem to make the most sense to start with them and to try and unpick the pyramid scheme from there. But the government doesn't want that to happen. And I think that's important, because, it's not, again, from what we heard at trial, it's nowhere near impossible to hold 3 or 4 other trials based on what we heard about various recruiters from that evidence. And yet they're refusing to do that. And that doesn't make any sense to me. If you're thinking about actually trying to uncover what happened to these victims, which is so much worse than the public knows. And there are people out there who do know and who could give evidence about how much it was. And, I think it's something that, again, as journalists, it's left to journalists, I think, to work out what's going on and who's being protected and why.
Well, I think what's being protected is a perfidious system.
Yes.
a system that's rotting within, that's predicated on blackmail. I
Yes.
saw it in the Franklin scandal. I saw it with the Jeffrey Epstein scandal. The Department of Justice and the FBI are protecting a system
Yep.
that is leading the United States off a cliff.
Mm-hmm.
And if Americans are apathetic about this, if Americans are apathetic about the government, in the very least, aiding and abetting child trafficking, if that doesn't wake them up, then I think that they're asleep behind the wheel.
Well, absolutely, and imaginable, and if I had been in the room hearing the testimony of those and knowing as I do that there are hundreds of others, I mean, it's very hard to understand how people feel able to look away from this.
I first acquired Epstein's Black Book in 2012, and it had the names of a lot of victims. And at that point, Epstein was being painted as a lone pervert by the media.
Yep.
And I got a hold, I was all off the record, but I did get a hold of some of the girls that were in the Black Book. I wanted to get victims first, and before I moved on, I just wanted to see if I could get, because when I did the Franklin scandal, it took a long time to get a lot of victims to talk. I had to cultivate a certain amount of trust.
Yeah.
But when I started talking to some of the girls in that book, they told me that they were flown to Little St. James, or now it's called Orgy Island.
Yeah.
And at that point, I knew it was a network, that Epstein was running a pedophile network. And I pitched it as such to the mainstream media, magazines in the mainstream media, but no one would touch it. Even though I had the Black Book, though. I mean,
I mean, it's incredible, actually. I mean, and that was 2012. That was more than 10 years ago. That, this could have been in the mainstream media, but for some reason, people weren't interested in hearing that story. And I think a lot of, the more I report on this, I think a lot of people don't want to just how widespread and how depraved this was. People really want to live in a world where this doesn't happen and people aren't this powerful that they can do things like this to children and get away with it. But unfortunately, we do live in that world, and I think people wanting to not believe that is a big part of why we can't convince people, for there to be more trials and more. I think a lot of this, even from speaking to people in my own life about it, a lot of people don't want to believe that this kind of thing could have been going on for 30 years, and that people are still getting away with it. They don't want to believe that they live in a world where that is possible, where people can be so wealthy and so powerful that they can abuse children and get away with it, and believe. I've heard from victims that Jeffrey and Ghislaine used to say that they never get caught for this kind of thing, and for 30 years they were right. And that's a terrifying fact about the world that we live in, and I think a lot of don't really want to accept that, which is why they'd love to kind of close the book on this and say, okay, well, one person's been jailed and so justice has been done. But I do think people need to wake up to the fact that we do live in a world where people can be so powerful that they can get away with what we normally in society see as one of the worst possible crimes. And yet, for some reason, in this particular instance, it's not being taken seriously for anyone apart from Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein, if he were to live long enough to be put on trial.
I've spoken at conferences, and I've talked to a number of victims of child sexual abuse. And that is something that they have to bear their entire lives.
Yep.
And if they're going to get better, Um, they have to. There's a lot of work that's required.
Absolutely.
In the Franklin scandal, a number of them became drug addicts, and
yes,
and then were ultimately put in prison for various offenses, and they compromised their own credibility, and that's what makes this system so perfect.
Yep.
That you get these kids generally from dysfunctional backgrounds.
Yep.
You molest them repeatedly and turn them on to drugs.
Yep.
And then at a certain point, they lose their youthful marketability, and then they're expunged. And ultimately, you're left with a victim that comes from a dysfunctional background, has been molested many times, and covers
yep.
it up, all the pain up with drugs and or alcohol.
Exactly. And you know, I found this so heartbreaking because, you know, I've written 2 books about the lasting effects of trauma, and the connection between child abuse and addiction in adulthood is scientifically clear at this point. You know, it's not really a debate among the scientific community, and yet 3 of the 4 victim witnesses were addicts at some point in their adult life. And we just watched hours of the defense attacking them for being drug addicts and saying, well, I'm not kidding, in so many words, well, how can we trust you because you're a drug addict? And it just completely twists the science, because them becoming drug addicts doesn't mean that this didn't happen. It actually corroborates that it did, if you look at the strong connection between those 2 things. And these victim witnesses were brave enough to say on the stand, yes, I started taking drugs to numb the memories of the quote unquote massages with Jeffrey. So they were completely open about the fact that they started using drugs because they couldn't tolerate the memories that they had, which happens so often with child abuse. And we have so much evidence about that. And yet, you know, we still have a system that allows a defense team to stand up and tell a jury in so many words, you can't trust these women because they're drug addicts.
It's truly unfortunate that that's how a lot of cases play out. There's the chief district judge for the District of Minnesota. His name is Patrick Schills, and he represented the Vatican and other churches in 500 different molestation cases.
Wow.
And he said that he felt that maybe of the 500 cases that he adjudicated, that maybe 10 weren't telling the truth.
Wow.
So he felt 98% of those 500 cases, those 500 victims were telling the truth. And
wow.
Why would someone come forward and be subjected to the kind of abuse that they're going to be subjected to?
Exactly.
It doesn't make any sense. Because
it doesn't.
If you say that you've been abused, there's going to be a whole new round of abuse. And yep. It's not going to be by your abusers. It's going to be by the legal system.
By the system, exactly. And we have a system that re-traumatizes victims as you know, as par for the course. That there is absolutely no protection. And I saw this firsthand at the Maxwell trial. There is no protection for victim witnesses. There's no sense of kind of the safety and well-being of survivors, and so they just have to subject themselves to hours and hours of cross-examination. I mean, in my book, I think a lot about kind of legal changes that could be made to limit the re-traumatization that happens in these kinds of trials, because, you know, as you said at the beginning, I'm a survivor. You know, there's lots of reasons why I couldn't put my assailant on trial, but certainly after witnessing the Maxwell trial, I mean, I don't know how they did it. I mean, it's absolutely awful what you get put through. And they got called liars, and they got called addicts, and they got, you know, they said that, you know, they just again and again and again just got accused of lying for a payday. Like they just wanted to take Jeffrey's money, so they made up a story. And that was the actual words that were used. You know, you made up a story about Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein so that you could get $1 million from the settlement. And, you know, it wouldn't take much legal reform to, you know, introduce some procedural rules. You know, this wouldn't even have to be at a congressional level. Some procedural rules about cross-examination that just take those kind of accusations off the table, because they're not helpful to a jury. They're not, you know, based in fact. It's just character assassination. And it's all this defense team had. So they really, really went for it. And I've since spoken to those victims, and some of them said that it was worse than what happened to them as children, you know. And we can't tolerate a system where victims feel that way. We have to change that.
I think that the statute of limitations should be abolished when it comes to sexual abuse. And the argument against that is that all these people will come forward and claim that they were abused. But going back to Judge Schultz, who represented 500 cases, he said 98% of them were telling the truth. Again, this is the type of thing that people generally don't lie about. And that's what's troubling is, as you said, they experienced another round of abuse. And what happened to a young woman in my book, Alicia Owen, she was indicted on 8 counts of perjury from a state grand jury and 8 counts of perjury from a federal grand jury. So she was looking at 200 years in prison.
Oh my God.
For refusing to recant her accounts of abuse. And
I mean, sorry.
And then, but she wouldn't recant. I mean, looking at 200 years, she would not recant. And there was a kangaroo court that sentenced her to between 9 and 15 years in prison. And the government really tried to destroy her by putting her in solitary for nearly 2 years. I mean,
wow.
Her story has to get out there.
Yeah.
And as I said, according to state and federal law enforcement, not a single child was abused by that network. And I have a tendency to believe that network was much bigger than Epstein's. Epstein's network was around for about 30 years or so. Whereas the particular network that I wrote about was around for about 12. But I think it was much, much bigger. And
interesting.
And kids were being flown to the East Coast, the West Coast, but it had the same type of there was intelligence was involved. I hate to say the CIA or the National Security Agent, because most people in the CIA probably don't even know about this dark, malignant corner of intelligence. And what's really troubling is all these kids. I mean, I got to talk to most of the ones that I found like 12 of them. I had a list of 60, and I found like 12 of them. And their damage is so extensive that they might not, a lot of them will never be productive members of society. It's kind of amazing. Alicia, who spent nearly 2 years in solitary, she's forged a very good life for herself.
Wow.
And I think we were talking about chemical dependence, and I think that with victims, if they have addiction issues and they don't address those issues, then they will never get better. They have to get clean before they can start addressing them.
Yeah, absolutely. And this was the wild thing about the Maxwell trial, is we had one victim witness who has been sober, I think, since she said either May 2001 or May 2003. So very, very long time. And since that time has set up a foundation for women who have substance abuse problems because of sexual trauma. So, she had addiction issues, she recovered, she set up a facility for people whose addiction issues stemmed from a similar thing to her. And then, we had another victim witness who has been clean for a very long time and is fighting, to stay clean every day, and is doing a wonderful job of that, and has done all the work that it takes to kind of climb out of the hole that child sexual abuse puts you in. And it really is a testament to all of them that they've been able to do that. And yet the fact that they were once substance dependent was used against them, and used to attack their credibility in a way that I've not seen before in a sexual abuse trial. Like it was quite remarkable how brazen it was.
In the book that I wrote, Boys Town, the orphanage on the outskirts, the famous orphanage on the outskirts of Omaha, Lawrence E. King, who is one of the main pimps of this network, was plundering Boys Town for underage kids, and he was actually flying these kids around the country. And Boys Town has never acknowledged that was, and actually the kids that have come forward, not because of Lawrence E. King, but because of Father James Kelly, who worked at Boys Town. And he was a serial pedophile. He molested a number of kids in upstate New York. And then the Catholic Church had the good sense to send him to Boys Town, where he molested a lot of kids.
It's awful, isn't it?
And Boys Town actually released their psychiatric reports to the public. I mean, that's how vicious Boys Town is.
That is, yeah.
And the iconic orphanage was so vicious to the kids that came forward. And Father Kelly was such a predator. I mean, he was eventually booted out of Boys Town, and he ended up in Las Vegas, working at a prison. But I was just stunned to see how vicious Boys Town was to these kids that came forward.
Yeah. And, it's just wild to imagine that these things are going on all the time, and that most people would like to imagine that they're not. But you and I know firsthand that these things are very real, and they do happen, and we need to find some way to stop the harm that this is causing to people. Because, as you said, surviving child abuse can become a full-time job, just getting through the day, dealing with traumatic memories, substance abuse issues, all of the things that trauma leaves you with. And yet our society seems to have very little interest in stopping these things from happening. And, I really hope that changes, because every day, this could be happening to people, and causing, in Judge Nathan's words in her sentencing remarks, incalculable harm to a number of people.
The Epstein cover-up has empowered the perpetrators, and it's undermined the victims. And
absolutely,
in Western civilization, it's everyone in it was covered internationally, and all those victims out there were completely undermined by the way that the U.S. government covered up these predators. What did you think of the Epstein or the Epstein victims' attorneys throughout the course of this litigation?
Yeah, I mean, there's I broke a story recently about a formal complaint made by one of the Epstein victims against David Boies, who represented Harvey Weinstein for a very, very long time, and who we know from court records, hired Black Cube to follow around Rose McGowan and discredit Harvey's victims. And when Harvey went down, he really needed kind of amend his reputation, and he started representing Epstein survivors. And there's now a group of attorneys who do this work, and I'm very sure that some of it is completely legitimate, but I do have questions based on what I know and documents that I've seen from victims about whether some of these attorneys had their clients' best interests at heart. And again, as a trained lawyer, I know what their ethical duties are. I know what the rules are, and I do have questions about whether these victims were properly represented, particularly given how vulnerable they were, and how hard it is to come forward against someone so powerful. These women came forward while Jeffrey was still alive, and that's terrifying. And the power dynamic that you have there between an attorney and a victim survivor is a seriously imbalanced one. And I do have questions about whether some of these attorneys may have abused that power.
Well, what are the particulars in the grievance that's been filed against David Boies?
So there are a couple of issues. One was the civil case that was brought against Jeffrey and Ghislaine. Sarah Ransom alleged in her formal complaint that they didn't collect any depositions or any evidence for that case, which, from what I can see on the court record, is true. And we fact checked everything in that story, and to its death. So she was asked to give a deposition in Virginia Giuffre's case, but there was no evidence collected in her case, and she was asked to settle early to keep legal costs down, which is not a conversation that an attorney should be having with a vulnerable client. She also signed away her rights in her settlement statement while she was heavily medicated. She just attempted suicide. She was in hospital. She had 2 broken legs. She was on heavy duty pain medication. And certainly, the ethics rules that I was trained in would say that a person like that is not in a fit state to sign a settlement that will affect the rest of their life.
And
there,
go ahead. I'm sorry.
And there was also an allegation because there was a picture that came out in 2018, but it was a picture from 2017 of David Boies having dinner with Harvey Weinstein and Bill Clinton. And because we know that there are victims who met Bill Clinton with Jeffrey Epstein, there's no allegations that I've been able to report or uncover of any abuse by him, but he was very much he was around a lot. And I got a quote for that story from a victim who said, well, of course I trusted that Jeffrey Epstein was a good guy because he was having dinner with Bill Clinton, and this is 2001, so he was a few months out of office, one of the most powerful people in the world. And basically one of the things in the formal complaint was, why is my lawyer sitting down having an intimate dinner with someone who I consider to be, part of this scheme? And again, that's not to say that there's any allegation of abuse by Bill Clinton, but just that he was very close to Jeffrey Epstein, and he was used by, I've heard from a lot of victims that he was used by Jeffrey a lot, kind of like, oh, I've just got to phone Bill Clinton, or that he was around, and that he gave Jeffrey a lot of credibility. So she kind of questioned, if my lawyer is, and the dinner was a consolation dinner when Hillary lost the 2016 election. So it was a pretty intimate setting, and the people who were invited to that consolation dinner were Harvey Weinstein and David Boies. And so one of the things that was in the complaint was, how can I trust that my lawyer has my best interests at heart if he is dining out with someone who I consider to be at least partly culpable in giving Jeffrey Epstein the credibility that he needed to keep this scheme going.
And the grievance essentially says that she was coerced into signing her settlement.
Yes, exactly. And that is how she feels, because of the state that she was in when she was asked to sign it, and because there was pressure put on her to sign it rather than to go forward to trial, which is what she wanted.
It's a very, very tragic tale, the Epstein scandal.
Yes, certainly is.
And Americans, if we're going to rectify this, we're not going to be able to we're not going to be able to rely on the government, and we're not going to be able to rely on the mainstream media.
Yeah. And I do think, again, that it falls on journalists who care about this to kind of keep working on it, because I genuinely believe I could be reporting on this for 10 years nonstop and would still keep finding out more and more and more and more and more, and if that's the case, then that's what I'll do, because I care about it deeply, and it feels that it feels like a lot of the mainstream media doesn't care about it so much. So I think it does fall on individual journalists who care very deeply about this issue to try and find out exactly what happened here, because I think so far we don't know the half of it.
I've been investigating Epstein for 11 years, and I've recently come across some information that I had no idea about. In regards to a perpetrator.
Right.
And there are perpetrators that I hear about that I hadn't previously heard about. So, and again, one of these perpetrators was very high in the government, cabinet level, and one of the perpetrators, or alleged perpetrators, is a tech multi-billionaire.
Yes. Yep. I've heard a lot about that.
And they think that they're above the law. And
so far they're right about that, which is the saddest thing.
And I think Americans are going to have to make a decision. Are they going to allow the government cover up of a bunch of child molesters, or are they going to mobilize and actually do something about it, like the Belgians did with the scandal?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're right, and I think if this lets if this is allowed to run its course, then this cover up will probably succeed, and I think it's important for all of us to make sure that doesn't happen, because, as you say, you've been reporting on this for 11 years. I've only been reporting on it for 2 years. And even I am hearing new names of perpetrators that shock me, and details of what actually happened in those rooms that are so shocking. I mean, this was so much more depraved and terrorizing than what we heard at the Maxwell trial. And I think that's important. It's
basically come down in the mainstream media to Jeffrey Epstein receiving massages. I mean, that's what it's distilled to. But like you, I have heard horrific accounts of what these girls were put through.
Yeah, this group of people, Jeffrey and Ghislaine as well, terrorized them. Like, this was not, people think that this was quote unquote just a case of, sexual abuse or coerced sex, but it wasn't. It was a regime of absolute terror, and when you know that, you can understand much more clearly how difficult it is for these victims to ever recover from what they went through. I can't imagine living with some of the memories that I've heard about.
One of the victims has told me that that Jeffrey Epstein pandered her to a former prime minister. And that this prime minister, his thing was being very sadistic to these.
Yes. Yep.
And ultimately, she said that she was put in the hospital by this guy. That and
I've heard this as well.
And here's a guy that was and if her allegations are true, here's a guy that was a prime minister of a country who gets off on beating up little girls.
Exactly. And who, if we're talking about the same person, and I assume we are because I have also heard this story, it has faced no consequences for that.
None whatsoever. And it's really, really troubling that
it is.
Because as Americans, we're going to have to decide, regardless of someone's position in society, they have to be treated as criminals, the criminals that they are.
They are, exactly. And at the moment, we're just, it's so sad and so obvious that we're not there yet.
And as I said before, it's going to take a grassroots movement to mobilize Americans. I collected a petition. It had 36,000 signatures on it. It had 5 Epstein victims on it. And it was backed by 42 anti-trafficking organizations. And it did nothing. It did nothing. And then I put on a demonstration while Ghislaine Maxwell's trial was going on, and it was backed by 64 anti-trafficking, anti-exploitation organizations. And the turnout was really, really diminutive. And I'm thinking to myself, 64 anti-trafficking, anti-exploitation organizations have signed this or backed this demonstration, and this is the kind of turnout that we're getting. So
I mean, absolutely, and I think the only thing to be done about that is for people like you and I to keep working, because I think if the public knew some of the things that you and I know, as opposed to the kind of very sanitized narrative that we heard at trial, they might feel, I would hope that they would feel much more strongly about turning out, and to demonstrations or going out onto the streets about this, because, so I think the most important thing is that we get those details out there as soon as possible so that we can mobilize people, because at the moment, they're being told a sanitized version of the story that you and I both know is the tip of the iceberg.
Well, Lucia, I really want to thank you for coming on the Nick Bryant podcast.
No, thank you for having me. It's a big honor. I'm a really big fan of your work, so thank you very much.
And have yourself a wonderful night.